When giants laugh at ants, the vast chamber of Nexus Prime stretched out like a metallic cathedral, its walls disappearing into shadows that seemed to swallow light itself. Thousands of beings from across the galaxy filled the enormous space there, voices creating a symphony of languages that would have driven most humans mad. But Admiral Sarah Chun stood quietly at the center podium, her hands clasped behind her back, watching the chaos with the patience of someone who had spent decades dealing with impossible situations. The emergency session of the Galactic Defense Council had been called for one reason: the Void Swarm had returned. After sleeping in the dark spaces between galaxies for 10,000 years, the ancient enemy was awake and hungry. Already, 3 outer rim systems had gone silent, their stars extinguished like candles in a hurricane. High Commander Zixtel of the Kethran Empire rose from his seat, his massive form casting shadows across the assembly floor. Standing nearly 4 meters tall, with skin like polished obsidian and eyes that glowed like dying stars, he was the perfect image of galactic military might. His voice boomed through the chamber's speakers as he spoke. Fellow defenders of civilization, he began, his words carrying the weight of authority earned through countless victories. The threat we face requires the combined strength of all our fleets. The Kethran Empire pledges 500 of our finest dreadnoughts to this cause. Each vessel carries enough firepower to crack a moon and shields that have never been breached. The assembly erupted in approving growls, clicks, and electronic chirps. 500 dreadnoughts was more military power than most species could imagine. The Kethran ships were legendary across the galaxy, massive black wedges of destruction that had conquered star systems with ease. Crystal singer Melodia flowed to her speaking position, her form shifting like living diamond caught in starlight. The Christian collective rarely involved themselves in galactic politics, preferring to tend their crystal gardens in the deep nebulae. But when they spoke, others listened. The collective offers 300 of our living ships, she sang, her voice creating harmonics that made the air itself shimmer. Our vessels are grown from the heart crystals of dying stars. They think as we think, dream as we dream. Together, we are one consciousness spread across the void. More cheers filled the chamber. Living ships were beyond the understanding of most species, vessels that could repair themselves, learn from battle, and coordinate with perfect precision. 300 such ships could hold entire sectors against any threat. Core Unit Prime rolled forward on its gravity platform, the mechanical representative of the Machina Union, where organic beings showed emotion through expression and gesture. The AI displayed its thoughts through shifting patterns of light across its chrome surface. Currently, those lights pulsed with what could only be described as confidence. The Machina Union contributes 400 vessels of optimal design. It announced in a voice like perfectly tuned instruments. Our ships operate with flawless coordination, executing battle plans calculated to 17 decimal places of precision. Victory probability increases by 23.7% with each additional unit. The chamber filled with the electronic equivalent of applause from dozens of AI representatives. 400 ships controlled by artificial intelligences that could process information faster than organic minds could comprehend was a force that could outmaneuver any enemy. One by one, the smaller civilizations announced their contributions. The feline hegemony pledged 47 stealth cruisers. The amphibious republic offered 63 assault carriers. Even the pacifist coalition, despite their philosophy, contributed medical ships and supply vessels. By the time the announcements finished, over 2,000 warships had been pledged to the defense fleet. It was the largest military force ever. Assembled in galactic history, enough firepower to reshape entire solar systems. The mood in the chamber had shifted from desperation to confident determination. Then the spotlight fell on Admiral Sarah Chun. she was unremarkable by galactic standards. A small human woman in a simple gray uniform, standing barely 1.7 meters tall. Her black hair was streaked with silver, and lines around her dark eyes spoke of years spent staring into the depths of space. Compared to the towering aliens around her, she looked like a child who had wandered into a gathering of giants. Admiral Chun, High Commander Zixdal rumbled, his voice carrying barely concealed amusement. Surely the humans, as one of the newer members of the galactic community, wish to contribute to this historic defense effort. Sarah stepped closer to the microphone, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. Earth's government has carefully considered our response to this threat, she began, her tone professional and calm. After extensive deliberation, we are contributing one ship to the defense fleet. The chamber fell silent. For a moment, the only sound was the distant hum of the station's life support systems. Then someone in the Kethron delegation started laughing, a deep, rumbling sound like boulders grinding together. The laughter spread like a virus, jumping from species to species until the entire chamber echoed with mirth. Commander Zixdal's glowing eyes practically sparkled with amusement. Did I hear correctly, Admiral? One ship? We pledge hundreds of vessels, and humanity offers one? That is correct, Sarah replied without a trace of embarrassment. The U's resilience will represent Earth in the coming battle. Crystal Singer. Melodia's harmonious voice took on notes of what might have been pity. Admiral Chun, perhaps there was a translation error? Surely you meant 100 ships, or at least one squadron. No translation error, Sarah confirmed. One ship. Core Unit Prime's lights flickered in patterns that indicated rapid calculation. Admiral, our projections indicate that a single human vessel, regardless of specifications, will contribute approximately 0.003% to total fleet effectiveness. This falls within the margin of statistical insignificance. The laughter grew louder. Beings who had been enemies for millennia found common ground in their amusement at humanity's apparent foolishness. Some delegates began placing bets on how long the human ship would survive once the fighting started. Perhaps, suggested a representative from the Molten Core Confederation, his volcanic voice bubbling with mirth, the humans could provide supply services instead. Leave the fighting to those equipped for it? Asterisk, more laughter. Sarah waited patiently for it to die down before responding. The U's resilience will fulfill her mission as assigned, she said simply. Earth has complete confidence in her crew and capabilities. High Commander Zixdal wiped what might have been tears from his glowing eyes. Of course, Admiral. We wouldn't dream of denying humanity its ... contribution. Though perhaps it would be wise to keep your vessel well behind the main battle line. For safety reasons, you understand. We appreciate the concern, Sarah replied. However, the resilience will operate according to her captain's judgment. As the session continued and battle plans were discussed, the human delegation became the subject of whispered jokes and barely concealed mockery. Other species began referring to Earth's contribution as the sacrifice ship or the comedy relief. Some suggested that the humans were either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, with most leaning toward the latter explanation. 3 days later, the human ship arrived at the staging area. The U's resilience was not what anyone expected. Where alien vessels gleamed with exotic metals and pulsed with energy fields, the human ship looked like a gray brick with engines attached. It was roughly 400 meters long, tiny by galactic standards, with a hull that seemed to be made of simple steel plating. Weapons that looked almost primitive jutted from its sides at odd angles, and scorch marks along the hull suggested it had seen better days. The ship's arrival sparked fresh waves of laughter throughout the fleet. Kethron officers wagered on whether it would explode from engine failure before the battle even started. Christian vessels sang funeral dirges for the doomed crew. Machina units calculated survival times measured in seconds rather than minutes. Commander Zixtal requested a visual inspection of the human vessel, ostensibly for fleet coordination purposes, but obviously to satisfy his curiosity about what the humans thought could survive against the void swarm. The inspection team boarded shuttles and flew to the Resilience, expecting to find a crew of delusional optimists or desperate volunteers. Instead, they found something that puzzled them. The human crew moved with quiet confidence, going about their duties with the easy competence of professionals who had served together for years. The ship's interior was cramped by galactic standards, but efficiently designed, with every system built for maximum reliability rather than impressive appearance. Captain Marcus Webb met the inspection team at the airlock. He was a man in his 40s, with graying temples and steady hands that spoke of years at the helm of dangerous missions. When High Commander Zixtal questioned him about his ship's capabilities, Webb simply smiled and said they would find out soon enough. The inspection team left more confused than when they had arrived. The humans weren't acting like people on a suicide mission. They weren't afraid, weren't desperate, and weren't making grand speeches about dying gloriously for their species. They were just working, preparing for battle with the same calm professionalism they might show when preparing for a routine patrol. That night, as the combined fleet made final preparations for the coming battle, the jokes about the human ship continued. Alien crews gathered in their recreation areas, sharing stories about the tiny gray vessel that thought it could stand against the void swarm. Some felt sorry for the doomed humans. Others thought they were getting what they deserved for their arrogance. None of them understood what they were about to witness. The next morning brought news that froze the laughter in every throat. Long-range sensors detected the void swarm's approach, a dark tide of destruction moving toward them at speeds that should have been impossible. The ancient enemy had awakened from its slumber between galaxies, and it was hungry. As alarms echoed through every ship in the fleet, crews raced to battle stations. The comedy was about to end, and the real show was about to begin. The galaxy had laughed at humanity's single ship, but they were about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one you underestimate. In the depths of space, the U's Resilience powered up its engines and began moving toward the approaching darkness. Whatever happened next, the galaxy would never laugh at humans the same way again. The ant at moved mountains. Bridge of the U's Resilience hummed with quiet activity as the crew prepared for what every military analyst in the galaxy had calculated would be their final mission. Unlike the massive command centers of alien flagships, the Human Bridge was compact and efficient, designed for a crew that worked as one organism rather than a hierarchy of specialists. Captain Marcus Webb stood at the center of it all, his eyes moving between the tactical displays, showing the approaching void swarm and the positioning of the Allied fleet. At 43, he had seen more combat than most officers twice his age, and his weathered hands moved with the unconscious precision of someone who had learned that the difference between life and death often came down to split-second decisions. Sensor sweep complete, Captain, reported Dr. Elena Vasquez from the science station. As the ship's chief science officer, she had spent the last 3 days analyzing every scrap of data about the void swarm that had been collected over the past 10,000 years. Where other species saw an unstoppable force of nature, she saw patterns and possibilities. The enemy formation is interesting. Webb glanced at her, noting the thoughtful expression that meant she had found something important. Define interesting. Doc. Elena's fingers danced across her console, bringing up a 3-dimensional representation of the approaching swarm. They're moving in perfect formation, too perfect. Every ship maintains exact spacing, exact velocity, exact heading. It's like watching a computer simulation. Lieutenant Jake Chaos Thompson looked up from the pilot's station, his hands still, moving across the controls as he ran final checks on the ship's maneuvering systems. At 28, he was the youngest member of the senior staff, but his reputation for impossible flying had earned him a place on the Resilience despite his habit of treating flight regulations as suggestions rather than rules. "So they're predictable?" he asked, a grin spreading across his face. "I can work with predictable." "It's more than that," Elena continued, her excitement growing as she realized the implications of her discovery. "Look at the formation structure. They're not just flying in perfect order, they're adapting in perfect order. When one ship changes course, they all change course. When one speeds up, they all speed up. It's like a hive mind with absolutely no individual variation." Commander Aisha Okafor, the ship's tactical officer, leaned forward in her chair. Her dark eyes held the calculating look of someone who had spent years turning enemy strengths into weaknesses. "You're thinking their greatest strength might also be their greatest weakness?" "Exactly," Elena nodded. "Perfect coordination requires perfect communication. Perfect communication requires predictable patterns. And predictable patterns can be exploited." The conversation was interrupted by a communication from the fleet command ship. High Commander Zixtal's massive form filled the main screen, his expression as serious as the approaching battle demanded. Behind him, the command center of the Kethron flagship bustled with activity as hundreds of officers coordinated the movements of over 2,000 vessels. "All ships, this is High Command," Zixtal announced, his voice carrying across the entire fleet. "Long-range sensors show the Void Swarm will arrive in approximately 6 hours. We will engage in Formation Delta 7, with dreadnoughts forming the primary battle line and support vessels maintaining standard spacing. All ships will coordinate fire patterns according to established protocols." He paused, and his glowing eyes seemed to focus directly on the Resilience. "Human vessel, you are assigned to grid reference Zulu 97, well behind the main engagement zone. Try to stay out of the way of the real warships." Webb acknowledged the transmission with professional courtesy, but Elena noticed the slight smile that played at the corners of his mouth. "Grid reference Zulu 97, Captain?" she asked. "About as far from the action as possible without actually being in the next star system," he replied. "They want us to be spectators to our own extinction." Chief Engineer Tommy Spark Rodriguez climbed onto the bridge from the lower decks. His coveralls stained with the exotic lubricants needed to keep the ship's systems running at peak efficiency. Despite his nickname, Tommy was actually known for his methodical approach to engineering problems. He had earned the name Spark, not for causing electrical fires, but for his ability to find creative solutions that other engineers missed. "Captain, we've got a problem," he announced, though his tone suggested it was the kind of problem he enjoyed solving. "The power coupling for the main engines is showing stress fractures. Standard procedure would be to replace the entire assembly, which would take about 18 hours. "But," Webb prompted, knowing his chief engineer well enough to recognize when he had an alternative plan. "But I can reroute power through the secondary systems and boost output by 15% above rated capacity. It'll hold together for about 8 hours before the whole thing comes apart, but it'll give us performance that would make a Kethron dreadnought jealous." Webb nodded. "Do it. If we're going to die today, let's at least die fast." As the crew made final preparations, the Allied fleet began moving into position. It was a magnificent sight, over 2,000 warships representing dozens of species. Their combined firepower enough to sterilize entire planets. The formation was a masterpiece of military coordination, with each vessel precisely positioned to maximize the effectiveness of concentrated fire while minimizing the risk of friendly fire incidents. Asterisk, the Void Swarm, appeared on long-range sensors as a dark cloud that seemed to swallow starlight. As it drew closer, Individual vessels became visible, organic ships that looked like they had been grown rather than built, their hulls pulsing with veins of sickly light. They moved with the terrible grace of predators, maintaining perfect formation despite their size and number. "Jesus," whispered Jake from the pilot station. "How many of them are there?" Elena checked her sensors and felt her stomach drop. Approximately 15,000 vessels, ranging from frigate-sized scouts to dreadnought-class bioships. And Captain ... They're all identical. Not just similar, absolutely identical, down to the molecular level. The implications hit everyone. On the bridge simultaneously. The Allied fleet was outnumbered more than 7-1, and they were facing an enemy that had been perfecting its tactics for 10,000 years. High Commander Zixtel's voice crackled over the communication system. "All ships, prepare for engagement. Fire on my command." The battle began with a light show that could have been seen from neighboring star systems. Over 2,000 ships opened fire simultaneously, their energy weapons creating a web of destruction that reached across space toward the void swarm. Plasma bolts the size of buildings, particle beams that could slice through asteroids, and exotic weapons that bent reality itself, all focused on the leading edge of the enemy formation. Asterisk. For a moment, it looked like the combined firepower of the Galactic Alliance might be enough. Void swarm vessels at the front of the formation began to burn and break apart under the concentrated assault. Cheers echoed across the communication channels as crews watched their weapons find their marks. Then the void swarm began to adapt. The enemy formation shifted with liquid grace, each ship moving in perfect synchronization with every other ship. The dense attack formation spread out, reducing the effectiveness of concentrated fire. Ships that had been damaged began to regenerate, their organic hulls healing like living tissue. Most terrifying of all, the void swarm began to return fire, with weapons that seemed to learn from each exchange. Where the first volley of enemy fire was scattered and relatively ineffective, the second volley was precisely targeted. The third volley began punching through energy shields that had been considered impenetrable. By the fourth volley, Allied ships were beginning to die. All ships maintained formation. Zixtel commanded, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty. That hadn't been there before. Continue firing patterns according to protocol. The Allied fleet was magnificent in its coordination, each ship fulfilling its role in the grand tactical plan with mechanical precision. But precision was exactly what the void swarm was designed to counter. Every time the Allied ships fired in coordinated volleys, the enemy learned to anticipate and counter. Every time they maneuvered according to established doctrine, the void swarm was ready with a response. Within an hour, the Allied fleet had lost over 300 ships. The perfect formations were beginning to break apart as vessels tried to avoid the increasingly accurate enemy fire. What had begun as a battle was becoming a slaughter. "Captain," Aisha called from the tactical station, "we're receiving orders to move to grid reference Zulu 97 and await further instructions." Webb looked at the tactical display showing the Allied fleet's deteriorating position, then at his crew. These were people who had served with him through impossible missions, who had learned to trust his judgment even when it seemed insane. Now they were being ordered to sit on the sidelines while their allies died. "Nav, plot a course for the center of the enemy formation," he ordered calmly. Jake's hands froze over his controls. "Captain, did you say the center of the enemy formation?" "You heard correctly. Elena, what's the most unpredictable thing we could do right now?" Dr. Vasquez thought for a moment, then smiled with the expression of someone who had just solved a particularly interesting puzzle. "Break formation, ignore all tactical doctrine, and attack in a completely random pattern. Aja, forget everything they taught us at the academy about proper engagement procedures. I want you to target enemy ships with no pattern whatsoever. Don't try to be efficient. Don't try to be logical. Be chaotic. Commander Okoffer's grin was sharp enough to cut steel. Chaos I can do, Captain. Tommy, I need everything you can give me. I don't care if we burn out every system on the ship, as long as we're still flying when it counts. Already on it, Captain. We'll be running so hot that our exhaust trail will show up on sensors from 3 systems away. The U's resilience broke from its assigned position and began accelerating toward the heart of the battle. Unlike every other ship in the Allied fleet, it didn't follow any recognizable attack pattern. It zigged when it should have zagged, accelerated when it should have decelerated, and turned in directions that made no tactical sense. The effect on the Void Swarm was immediate and dramatic. Ships that had been adapting to counter the predictable attacks of the Allied fleet suddenly found themselves facing something they couldn't analyze or anticipate. The perfect coordination of their formation began to break down as individual. Vessels tried to track a target that seemed to move according to no logic at all. Enemy ships are trying to establish a targeting pattern on us, Aisha reported, her hands flying over the tactical controls as she randomly selected targets throughout the enemy formation. They can't lock on because we're not following any consistent flight path. Keep it random, Webb ordered. Jake, I need you to fly like you're drunk, insane, and late for dinner, all at the same time. Best order I've ever received, Captain, Jake laughed, throwing the ship into a corkscrew, turn that should have been impossible for a vessel of their size. The Resilience dove into the heart of the Void Swarm formation, its weapons firing in all directions with no apparent pattern. Where the alien fleet had tried to fight the enemy, according to established military doctrine, the humans were rewriting the rules of engagement with every passing second. Captain, I'm detecting confusion in the enemy formation, Elena reported with growing excitement. Their communication patterns are becoming erratic. They're trying to coordinate responses to our attacks, but they can't predict what we're going to do next because we don't know what we're going to do next. The small human ship carved through the enemy formation like a stone through water, its random movements creating ripples of chaos that spread throughout the Void Swarm. Ships that had maintained perfect spacing for 10,000 years began to collide with each other as they tried to track a target that refused to behave according to any known pattern. All Allied ships, Webb broadcast on the Fleet Command frequency, ignore standard tactical doctrine. Attack individually, move unpredictably, and don't coordinate with anyone else. Make every ship its own random variable. High Commander Zixtal's voice crackled with disbelief. Human vessel, return to formation immediately. You're violating every principle of fleet engagement. With respect, Commander, Webb replied as his ship executed another impossible maneuver that left 3 enemy vessels firing at empty space. Your principles are getting everyone killed. Trust me on this one. One by one, the surviving Allied ships began to break formation. The Kethron dreadnoughts abandoned their precise battle lines and began attacking individual targets. The Christian vessels stopped coordinating their song-like attacks and began improvising deadly solos. Even the logical machina units began introducing random variables into their targeting systems. The effect was like throwing a wrench into a perfectly tuned machine. The Void Swarm, which had spent 10,000 years perfecting its ability to counter coordinated attacks, found itself facing something it had never encountered before: absolute chaos. Enemy ships began to collide with each other as their perfect coordination broke down. The organic vessels, which had adapted to counter every logical attack pattern, couldn't adapt to attacks that had no pattern at all. The beautiful, deadly formation that had swept across the galaxy for millennia began to tear itself apart from fin. Within, Captain, Aisha called out, her voice filled with amazement. Enemy casualties are climbing exponentially. They're not just losing ships to our attacks, they're losing ships to each other. Webb watched the tactical display as the tide of battle shifted. The void swarm, which had seemed unstoppable just hours ago, was beginning to retreat. Their perfect adaptation had become their perfect weakness when faced with an enemy that refused to be predictable. "Elena, remind me to buy the entire crew dinner when we get home," he said, watching as the last enemy vessels fled into hyperspace. "Assuming we can find a restaurant that serves chaos as a side dish." Asterisk the allied fleet that had begun the day. With over 2,000 ships had been reduced to fewer than 800, but they had won. The galaxy had been saved not by superior firepower or advanced technology, but by the simple human refusal to do things the way they were supposed to be done. As the celebration began across the fleet communication channels, Admiral Sarah Chun's voice cut through the noise with quiet authority. "This is Admiral Chun to all vessels. The threat has been neutralized, but let's remember that the real victory here wasn't achieved by any single ship or species. It was achieved by learning to adapt, to change, and to find strength in our differences rather than our similarities." Hi. Commander Zixtal requested a private communication with the Resilience. When his image appeared on the main screen, the arrogant alien warrior who had dismissed humanity just days ago looked at Captain Webb with something approaching reverence. Asterisk.